everyone.
Well, hello.
I hope y'all can hear us okay.
Yes, today we can't set up our microphone because, of course, we're actually going to be going live with someone else.
Yeah, we're going to be talking with Travis Sanders, and he's a clairvoyant and modern spiritualist. So we're going to talk all things spiritualism, mediumship, and seances.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And we're just going to give him a few minutes to log in.
Yes.
But if you haven't known, we are starting I guess right now we're in the middle of our launch for School of Occult Arts. And we have a free lecture coming up, which if you want to, you can send us a message and we will send you the link for that event. And we're just bringing Travis in now.
Click the button.
Perfect.
Connecting.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
We're doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Can you hear us?
Perfect. Yes.
Awesome.
Well, it's good to finally talk with you.
I know. We've gone back and forth in the stories and in each other's direct messages, but it's nice to finally speak with you.
Likewise, likewise.
Yeah, so you've been a medium for a while, and I guess to get things started right away, I wanted to know how you came to mediumship.
Well, that was a journey. I grew up in a Pentecostal household, so that was an interesting start. My father, my mom's side of the family was very religious. My dad's side of the family was more, I guess, agnostic, if I had to put any type of label to it. And I was just the weird kid. I was the weird kid who wasn't like the rest of the family, who was overly sensitive. And when I think it was 99, my grandmother passed away. It was the first major death. And that kind of blew the doors open on A, certain activities and things that I was seeing, hearing, feeling, but B, also anxiety and panic attacks, which was very hard to kind of separate one from the other. But I just kind of like stayed in that sensitivity up until middle school. And, when puberty happens, that sort of stuff went a little more haywire. I started having out-of-body experiences, things I couldn't explain. And that sort of sent me on a journey of searching. So my first job was at a library, and I started like devouring everything from like old stuff like the Edgar Cayce materials to world religions. And I started reading these things. I was like, oh, there's a name for this. Other people are having these experiences. I'm not a freak. I'm not psychotic. And it really just kind of took off from there.
Yeah.
Wow, a lot of similarities with Dan here.
Yeah, a lot of that resonates for me. Even the library thing, because we went to a private Christian college, which is actually where we met. And my job there, I was working in the library. And oddly enough, this private Anabaptist Christian college was the place I encountered my first occult book. And so like really dove into esoterica and had a lot of the same experiences you did of like, oh, wow, I'm not actually a crazy person. This is something other people have had experience with for a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think growing up kind of weird too, and I guess staying weird, all of us have stayed a little bit strange.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, that's so cool that you're able to integrate that experience, because I know that in our work we have a lot of people who are in their 30s and are saying, I had this experience and then they would say I turned it off, like I shut it down and I didn't integrate any of that. And now that I'm older and I realize that I have this freedom and that some of this is real, now I have to kind of do the work to learn to trust myself again.
Right.
And that's very hard, but like so many people go through that. So it's really cool to hear that you like found that earlier.
Yeah, and I was very lucky too, in that even though I was brought up Pentecostal, I was part of the church until I was 17. My mom, because when you're Pentecostal, everything's the devil. So, because we were all like tent revivals and Holy Ghost and all that. But she was always very allowing of me to be who I was, as to where, my brother was hunting, fishing, that sort of thing. And I'm like into rocks and that's what, and she allowed that. And even though a lot of what sort of came to the forefront challenged her personal belief system, she still let me be. So I think that was really important in maintaining that, so I didn't shut down.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that it's interesting, speaking to like a Pentecostal background that tends to have some more, as you were saying, like that kind of tent revival, Holy Spirit kind of movement that in some ways is maybe one of the closer Protestant denominations to get to mediumship in some ways, or at least spirit-led experiences, where I think of like Baptist traditions that really don't have that.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of like practicing of the gifts of the Spirit, things like that. So, in church, it was nothing to see someone give prophecy. And then looking back in retrospect, you're like, they're kind of doing readings.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
The linguistic framework that we're kind of bumping up against. I think when we talk about spirit activity, that was one of the things that really triggered my experiences, was I didn't really know what some of these experiences were. And the framework was such that it was really only like, oh, well, it's demons, like you said, or it's the devil. And on the other side of that was like History Channel documentaries being like, that's all aliens. And so like there was no linguistic mechanism for, well, what actually am I experiencing? How do I put words to this?
Right.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. So you say you're a modern spiritualist.
Yeah.
Did you sort of, did spiritualism come first, or maybe that's the kind of ridiculous question?
It actually,
egg type of thing.
When I was 19, I filmed a TV show for A&E called Psychic Kids. And back when I was a little baby psychic. And the mentor that they brought in on that show was a forensic medium from Toledo. And she was the one who actually introduced me to spiritualism, not just in the broad sense of the word, but in the actual spiritualist church movement. She was a medium in the churches, her parents, her grandparents. And so that sort of sent, like, I'm a big history nerd. So that really sent me into the history of spiritualism. And she also introduced me to some of the things that, because prior to her influence, a lot of what I had was more new agey. She brought me to a lot of the old things that are now making a resurgence, like trance and physical phenomena and stuff like that. So once I started going to churches and the spiritualist camps, and the thing that, because I'm not a religious person, even though I identify as a spiritualist, but when I look at those basic tenets of whether it's the SNU in the UK or the NSAC here, it's very non-dogmatic, and it really lets you pretty much believe what you want to be. Their philosophy is kind of like, we all survive death and don't be a dick. And I'm like, that's the religion I can get on board with.
Yeah. I love that.
That's great.
Yeah, there are a lot of tenets of spiritualism that really resonate with us.
Yeah, I think often about spiritualism and like the early movement of it, it has like these religious overtones that I think some people are afraid to embrace, because a lot of people coming into New Age individuals are like ex-evangelical. They're like, they're working through trauma and pain that's caused by a church. So to have someone who uses this very like kind of Jesus or very churchy language or church-like settings can be a little like hair-raising sometimes, or can be create some distance. But I always like to think about it from like a chaos magic perspective of like, we're just plugging this into like a wall. We're plugging it into a power source of some kind. And whatever we call that power source that we're plugging things into, that's, I guess, more or less up for debate. But if we look at the historical shift and the historical trend of like where spiritualism comes from and its place in America at the time, or the place in the UK at the time, it really does have this like contextualized history, but also something that's kind of neat about like getting in touch with something that's happening with like the larger culture, I'll say. Like the ability for spiritualism and the spiritualist movement to plug into larger culture is something that I think a lot of modern spiritual tradition might struggle with, to be honest.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. It's almost, um, sort of the polar opposite of, in its prime, spiritualism was on the cutting edge of social reform and
Hmm.
suffrage and abolitionism and gay rights and free
Yeah.
love. Um, and it is a lot of that traditional religious stuff that they can't let go of, which is why, like, it's so hard to even find a church in America anymore,
Mhm.
because our generation isn't as much interested in the like crusty old hymnals and the organ music and the stuff like that. And I almost feel like the aspect of it as a philosophy, if we approached it almost like they did in Brazil and France with Spiritism and looked at it more as centers instead of churches, learning centers,
Mm.
it would probably do a little better.
Yeah, that feels very of the times. I like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a cool concept. So maybe that's the way it might be trending, perhaps.
Well, and it's interesting too with the pandemic and everything, being virtual and Zoom. It's forced a lot of these people who've been stuck in the past, because most, if you go to any sort of spiritualist church or organization, they're like in their 70s.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of young people. It's forced them sort of into the 21st century. So maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Maybe, maybe. I always think it's surprising how people don't recognize like the very like on the ground workaday kind of like progressive nature of early spiritualism, seances, mediumship, as described. People often think it's like, what you see in the movies, and we certainly get that because our aesthetic is very, it's a very aesthetic. We'll put it
Yeah,
that way.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so people often have questions about like, oh, well, like, is it like haunted houses or like it's like the Conjuring films? But that real kind of tangible, like we're talking about spirits talking about abolition and women's rights and women's suffrage, and like that is something that is so vital right now and seems to be something people don't necessarily expect to get from a mediumistic experience.
Mm-mm. No, sadly, a lot of it has become entertainment.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, because we do, of course, we work heavily within seance, and we don't really work within seances like people expect seances. We look at them as ritual. We look at them as ritual intention spaces
Mhm.
where people have the intent to make a connection with spirit. Um, Tell us a little bit about your experiences, though, with that, and how seances you've held or attended have gone, and your thoughts.
So my I guess, like, in the sense of however you want to view the word, doing things like group messages or co-platform or whatever,
Mhm.
is something that I've done over the years. It wasn't really, I think the thing that kind of moved me a little bit more in that direction was that very first mentor of mine was a phenomenal trance medium. And when she would sit for trance, um, it was almost like I would start to see this buildup of this gaseous, oily looking material around her.
Mhm.
Um, and that always really intrigued me. And, she was always very strict about things like lighting and noise and stuff like that, which I didn't understand at the time. Now I do. But I really became interested in seances in the physical aspect when it was about 5 or 6 years ago. I was doing a workshop at Camp Chesterfield in Indiana,
Mhm.
and I didn't know who he was at the time. He approached me afterwards and said, I come to find out later he was the president at one point of the organization, but he said, I have these group of students. They've been sitting for physical phenomena for many years. Would you want to come and sit in on one of our seances? And I was like, well, yeah, because I knew from a logical perspective what I could encounter, but the experience of it was something that was entirely different.
Mhm.
So I go to Michigan, and we're in this little tiny room in this lady's basement, and it's me and I think four other people, and the lights go out, and they're doing things like singing songs and um, doing like om chanting and things like that to build energy. And I'm like, okay, it's weird, I'll go with it. And there were these seance trumpets that were in the center of the room. And after about maybe 10, 15 minutes, you could start to hear them rattling. And then after a while, they lifted into the air, and voices, as clear as you and I are conversing, started having conversations with people. And these lights started dancing around the ceiling, and smells came. It was nuts. It really just kind of blew my mind open. And I sat with them several times. The thing that I think really sort of moved me from believing into knowing, because there's part of the brain where I was like, okay, are there speakers? Are there wires? But I just moved into a new house, and my partner at the time, we left to go like Walmart or something to get some things that we needed for the house. And when we came back, the burners on the stove were going. And I was like, well, obviously we didn't leave the stove going full blast. So I was like, okay, that's weird. So I asked the question, do you know who turned the burners on the stove on? And I can't remember who they said it was, but the thing that really got me was they said, don't worry, we made sure the paper towels didn't catch on fire. And the thing that I just kept saying over and over again was, the paper towels were right by the stove. It's a miracle the house didn't catch on fire. And that was something nobody could have known. So I sat with them for several, maybe 5 or 6 seances. And that inspired me to form my own home circle. So we sat for about 2 years. I had a room in the house that I dedicated solely to sitting for physical phenomena. And it was very slow going. We had little things in the beginning, like snaps or clicks, almost like what you would think of as the house settling, but it only seemed to happen in that hour that we were in the room. And it took about maybe 2 years, but towards the end, there was some slight movement of the trumpet. And then I ended up moving, and I don't have a seance room anymore. So I kind of wonder, you know, what could have developed if that sitting would have been able to continue. But that's currently where it's at.
So what do you think was happening on a like metaphysical level, on a spiritual level in that space? Because like when we do seances, like we're often, you know, traveling, we're often working in other people's space. And so there's that ritual component. And we always tell people like your tools, the tools you bring to this, whether it's an athame or a pendulum or whatever you're using, they will learn over time what they're supposed to do, like how they're supposed to interface with you and spirit. But why is that, do you think? Like, why do spirits not just know, oh, I'm supposed to sit down and move the trumpet or talk through it? Like, what is that process? Is it the people opening themselves? Is it the intent taking form and literally manifesting? Or is it spirit is like learning how to interface with the physical space?
I personally feel like with any form of mediumship, but especially with physical phenomena, it's almost like a soup, and there's so many different variables. So I think a big part of it is 1, establishing harmony, and then 2, building of the energy. And then I also think, you know, like if you're doing mental mediumship, you have your guides, inspirers, and helpers that work with you. But I think too, when you're getting into the physical element, you know, some people use the term spirit operators that are composed of scientists and doctors and all sorts of things. And they're really learning, okay, here's the energy that you're bringing, here's the energy that we're bringing. How can we manipulate this and tweak this and get it just right so we can get the effects that we need to get? But I also have no concrete idea.
Yeah, sure. No, we always, it's theorizing. That's the most fun, I think, is we get a lot of questions on interviews. And we were just on Coast to Coast last week, and someone asked us, oh, so what's the other side like? And I think every medium gets this question. And it's just like, I don't know. Like all the spirits seem to be doing something.
Yeah. Hopefully not for a while. We won't find out.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, for a little bit. So that's really interesting. I've heard that we are coming up into a new age of physical mediumship. And it's something that's really interesting to Dan and I, but, you know, we don't have that. Right now, we don't have like a room where we do it weekly with people.
Right.
So it's hard for us to like get the physical manifestation.
It is. We had this experience. Yeah. No, we've had like weird things happen a couple times. And like you say that in the context of a seance, and it's like, what do you mean? Everything is weird. But we have definitely, and we've spoken to it quite a bit, so I'll keep it brief. But we did have an experience in a really like energetically charged space with Eckharts. And that was one of those experiences for me. And that's probably the reason why I talk about it so much, where I moved from that realm of knowing to like, as you said, like we moved from the realm of like believing to knowing, to being like, oh yes, like this is something that happens. And this is really like, it just defies every explanation. Like, how did this thing get here?
Yeah.
But we haven't had consistent work with that. And frankly, we haven't really worked towards that. I do have some concerns about making like the focal point of one's work is like, is physical mediumship. But I have been reading also that like there's a lot of people who are getting more and more involved. Do you see an uptick like in your end on physical mediumship and people who are interested in it?
There is, and there's also sort of a shift that's happening, I think, in the way that spirit's producing it. You know, through the Victorian era, it was primarily ectoplasmic. And even though there have been mediums through history that haven't necessarily worked that way, really since the early 90s, and with Robin Foy and the school experiments, they've been pioneering more energy-based phenomena. And so it doesn't work with a soul medium, but more of a collective energy, and it's much safer than sort of ectoplasmic workings. And so a lot of groups, things seem to go popularity, like in waves. So, trance is very popular right now. Physical stuff has been very popular for a while, and it's kind of maybe fading a little bit more. But it definitely seems like it only makes sense to me as we evolve here, they have to adjust to how they work with us because the conditions change.
No, that makes sense. And we bring something to this as like someone who promotes or who approaches this primarily through the lens of like magical working. We, to some degree or another, probably co-create the way in which spirit manifests. Like the way we expect to see it is a channel that is open for us to see it. And so today, where people are a little bit, I would say the lay public is more suspicious of or skeptical towards ectoplasm, there does seem to be this trajectory towards now, things seem to be more energetic, as you were saying. I'm intrigued, though, to see where that continues to go and how that continues to build, because there was a time where mediums were so associated with physical phenomena.
Right.
And lately, I would say over the past decade or two, it's been very mentally oriented, very readings oriented, which is fantastic. But I love that idea of the physical.
So exciting.
Yeah.
So exciting to us, I think.
And the energetic approach too seems to be a little bit more light tolerant as well. So I think that helps a bit.
Yeah, no, definitely.
That's true. Yeah, we don't do our seances in complete dark, mostly because we do them traveling or in buildings where, historic places that's hard to actually manage the light. Yeah.
Right.
So we have to work with like other tools rather than trying to get more light sensitive things. But I think in the future, we'd love to try something.
And I think it puts people at ease because if we look like, say, the 1850s and everything is, there aren't electric lights yet. At least I don't think there are. Maybe in laboratory settings, but everything's candlelight for the average Joe public person. People at that time literally had a better understanding of light and dark in some ways than we do, because we have so much artificial light around us all the time. Even when I sleep, my cell phone is pulsing in the corner with weird LED light on it. So to put someone in a modern context in a purely black environment, and Kat and I we used to do some cave diving and exploring and spelunking.
Wow. And
that was a really wild experience to be in the earth, in that total darkness where there was nothing around you, where people, it was super unnerving. And I think people who are in that sitting for the first time in a seance where they cannot see their hand in front of them, in our experience, it just opened them up to have a negative experience, to be put in a space where they were maybe hyper anxious or hyper aware.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too, one of the things that I like about your guys' work is spirit, I think, is only limited by how we limit them. And so you're having to adjust to different circumstances or incorporating different occult aspects into it to see what works, what doesn't work. You know, I think that's important because it's the only way we're going to get into new territories.
Oh,
well, thank you.
That's true.
And
that makes sense.
That segs into a great question. Where do you see your work, but where do you see mediumship in general kind of like going? What does the future look like to you, or the future you wish to imagine or vision?
That's a really great question. The personal side of it, you know, most people know me for the readings and stuff, but my true passion is in teaching. So in my fantasy dream world, I would love to have like a Professor Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters kind of situation going on. Who knows? And I also love the writing very, very much. But I can't ever see myself not doing sessions in some form or format. Collectively, I have no idea. Part of me feels like we're at this place where I think more people believe now than ever. And because there are sort of resurgences of old things like trans and physical phenomena, I think that that's always a temporary, necessity. My hope is that people get to the point where like there's always going to be a need for evidential communication or healing. But I really think that if we can take survival as a truth, that kind of can open some doors to some really wonderful teachings and philosophies. You know, I manage a metaphysical shop when I'm not seeing clients. And prior to the pandemic, 95% of our clientele was women between the ages of 50 and 70. If you go into my shop on any given day now, it's all 20-year-olds, probably from TikTok. But it's this whole new generation. And I think that once the sort of pizzazz and maybe sparkle wears off a little bit, they can see that there's actually some really helpful, soul nurturing things that can come from this.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. No. I've been seeing that as well. We're kind of part of an online younger community of witches, really, who are in total agreement or belief in many tenets of spiritualism and survival of consciousness. And now it's just using that kind of in an alchemical way to heal oneself and to grow. And it's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's been my biggest frustration with the way things currently stand in mediumship land. And I'd say like that's such a broad, big, I purposefully use mediumship because there are so many people working that you can't categorize it. But if we were to paint in broad strokes, and I understand why there's a premium or a high price placed on evidential mediumship. And I think it's important to know that, like, you know, there is that evidence of something beyond, and that's great. But at what point then do we recognize that spirits and people have had private lives and interior lives? And some of the things they tell us may not track to something that we can verify looking backwards. What can they tell us about moving forwards? What can we learn by having this connection, not just with people or spirits we knew, but with the idea that the human race does not die? Like, what happens when we say, I don't die? Like, what does that mean for people? What does that mean for the planet? What does that mean for where humanity goes?
Just easy.
Yeah, I know. So you can tell I get excited by that. Question. And I'm not asking you to answer that. I'm just saying, into the ether, what does that mean? That's an exciting space to be.
Oh, absolutely. I think you guys pressed. There you are. No, for sure. And I think that that's where, you know, trying to say here.
Unfortunately, I think you just froze for us as well.
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, it's incredibly exciting. And, you know, it's one of those things where, too, like, not only am I never going to die, but I've also never not existed. Just trying to wrap your mind around eternity is kind of bonkers.
Right.
That's cool.
It's true. It's true.
It's humbling to think about, but it's also exalting and big in a lovely way.
Right.
I can't let you go without talking about channeled art and spirit photography, because I think you do some of that, and I'd love to hear more about that.
I'm a dabbler, so it's like I know my lane, but I also like to play with other things just because it's fun. So I don't consider myself a spirit artist by any means. It's just something that I like to play with. One thing that I think is really fun, and sometimes I teach in some classes, are the orographs, which is sort of like a mandala. It's basically a representation of what's perceived in the auric field. So it can be worked psychically with everything sort of being metaphorical, or you could take it into a mediumistic link. You know, there's the willow tree here. I have an older woman. She's showing me that her name was Willow, that kind of thing. And I don't do spirit portraiture in the sense of there are some really amazing evidential spirit portraiturists, drawers, who sit down and, you know, draw your grandma. But there are times where certain things will come to me in meditation or whatever. The one I think I may have posted to Facebook was this one, where I was studying for trance, and this lady came into my head, and it just ate at me until I drew her. Like I had to get it out. And so I did, and maybe a few days later, on YouTube, this documentary about the Gullah Nation in the Carolinas popped up, and it showed the women and their clothing. And so I posted a picture on Instagram for anybody who wants to scroll back of the screenshot from the documentary, the clothing, what she's wearing, and the drawing, and how they match up.
Wow. That's so cool. I love stuff like that.
I love that spirit also is like, you know, you're going to want to document this.
Right? Because even now there are some times where I'm like, have I been delusional for the past 15 years? And then they'll do something where it's like, okay, I get it. I'll stop doubting. And then the spirit photography is just, again, plain. Like some of the pictures that I posted the other night were some experiments with light and water and film. And there was one where there's like a face in the reflection of a photo that was just a happy accident. So I just like experimenting with different things. And another thing that's kind of fun is skatography, where in usually seance conditions or red lighting, we'll take photo paper and they'll hold it to the solar plexus, and images and stuff like that will develop. But finding the chemicals is super hard now because everything's digital, and so it's super expensive. So there's not a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
If only we had the time and
time. That's what it boils down to, right?
Yeah. I love that concept you were talking about, though, with that woman, and then, of course, finding it in the documentary. Because today we have a small coven we work with, and I was talking in the seance coven about after going through a trance session, writing or drawing or just getting it out on paper. And the importance of that, not just as a tool for, transcribing what you saw or felt or visioned, but also as like a teaching mechanism for your brain to say, I'm now bringing this into the quote unquote real world to help alleviate some of that tension we feel. Because you spoke to this already. You said after 15 years, I still have this. And same with us. There are still moments where we say, this person is, I'm getting this name, and I'm getting that it's for this person. And I know I should trust myself. But also, am I just totally bonkers? And now's when the shoe drops.
Right.
So,
well, it's funny. It's usually not a name. It's usually something weirder.
Yeah, it's usually something weird.
Like a visual, like, what? Yeah. What is coming to me?
But I love that.
So funny. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to, and it's so odd how oftentimes those things that are like way out on a branch are usually the things that end up being like the nail in the coffin for people.
Yeah.
Yes, it's so weird. And that's why, it's so much about trusting yourself. Not just yourself, but your many selves.
Yes.
That sounds very strange, but
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I want to be respectful of your time, certainly. This has been great, and thanks for joining us on this. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about your book.
Yeah.
So probably the one pertaining to what we're talking about today was practical mediumship. The first book I wrote was more towards psychic development. This is more towards cultivating mediumship. And I wrote it just because I like to write and I like to teach, but I also think too, in this age of like witch talk and things like that, there's a lot of horseshit that's out there. And so it can be fun, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to like my teaching style, I'm a very like nuts and bolts down to here's the practical stuff. If it doesn't serve you, if it's over analytical, if it's over fluffy, like you don't need the unicorn and the rainbow to talk to grandma, let's throw that out the door. So that's really what the book is about, because I think a lot of times what we see, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is you may have someone who has a genuine ability, but they're also maybe not the most grounded. And so that line between what they're perceiving spiritually and their own imagination gets blurred. And then that's where things go a little wonky. So that's why I wrote that.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Yeah, we get questions about that a lot. Like, how do I know if it's spirit versus my own brain? And then a lot of people come to us as well with kind of issues facing spirit contact that they don't feel is like good enough. Or they don't feel it's like trance, so they're not really getting messages that they think are legitimate.
And part of that, as you said, speaks to kind of the mystique we've built around these various traditions. I, as like a chaos magician, really resonate with stripping this all back to what are the basics? What can we get away with? What works? What's the tech? As opposed,
what's most accessible?
Exactly. As opposed to, as much as I love like ritual traditions and will implement ritual traditions, sometimes we can become so wed to Crowley or to the Setharoths that we just we can't receive anything else. So I love that idea of trying to be as grounded as we can and trying to add in what is beneficial, but strip out the stuff that just doesn't work for you.
Yeah, and when I teach, if someone develops and they want to do readings while like juggling upside down and that's their thing and they've got a good foundation, then go juggle upside down. But whenever I teach, be it psychic work or the mediumistic aspect, the first thing I always go to is know yourself, because you want to connect with spirits, but you don't know yourself as a spirit first. And then if you want to get crazy with it, go get crazy with it. But that basic, like, know thyself. And that's where, if you know what you feel like, if something comes into your mind, well, does it feel like you or does it feel like spirit? And that to me is sort of that difference.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Very well stated. Very well stated.
Yeah, I do think I see the teaching streak in you. For sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope we continue, of course, to stay in touch, because this has always been a lot of fun and we should do this again sometime.
Oh, for sure. I would love that. It's funny, like in the back and forth or whatever, I'm always like, who am I talking to? You're sort of like one entity. But yeah. So in the future, I'll be like, maybe this will be a good psychic game. Is this Dan or is this Kat?
I love that.
Ask us and we'll definitely tell you if you're right. Okay. People don't realize it is often, we trade off midway through conversations. She'll be doing something and I'll say, oh, I know the answer to this. Okay, here we go. And in the beginning, it was very easy to tell the difference because we have different styles. But now it's become the same. We are one.
Hive mind.
Yes. Perfect. Well, have a great night.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care.
See ya.
Bye.